Welcome to the weekly duck migration forecast, episode 2, the October kickoff. Please send me your questions to weeklyduckmigrationforecast@gmail.com. I will answer these at the beginning of each episode. Questions on waterfall migration in general, duck migration, duck ecology, waterfall science are welcomed. We have a few good questions from this week. We did get some questions this week. Paul in the lower Mississippi Valley writes, will you be posting these on your webpage this year? Paul, unfortunately, we're not. I'm not going to be posting the PDFs. They were relatively complicated. We did get a lot of comments from folks that they liked the material, but it was too in-depth. So I thought maybe something like a 10-minute video, something you could listen to on your way to work might be more appropriate. So we'll be doing these YouTube channel videos weekly this year. Nick from Bemidji, Minnesota writes, I hunt mostly divers on the upper Miss. Why are your forecasts more accurate for dabblers than divers? The unfortunate thing right now is we do not have models that predict diving duck migration based on weather. We're going to be working on those with some folks in the Central Flyway here coming up, but we do not have them now. So what we have are models that use weather variables, temperature, and snow cover to predict migration of mallards, black ducks, pintails, gadwall, shovelers, Wigeon and Green-winged teal at this time. Jake, my friend Jake from the Chesapeake writes, why are comments disabled on your YouTube channel? That's where the real information comes from. I know he's joking, but just trying to keep things civil on here and informative. So if you have questions or comments, please do send them to that Gmail account at weeklyduckmigrationforecast@gmail.com. The new format for the 2021 season is these weekly videos, so please subscribe by clicking the button below. Again, email me your questions, and the plan is to post these weekly on Sunday night. Sometimes I might not get to it because of family obligations, so they may occur on Monday morning like they did this week. The locations we use for our weather severity index calculations, and you can go to episode 1 to see how the weather severity indices were developed. But we collect data from throughout the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways and do a pretty good covering as far as weather factors go. And in the past has done a reasonable job of predicting timing of migration. We only go as far south as Memphis and Charlotte, North Carolina, because once birds get below that latitude, they tend to move around a lot based on food availability and then disturbance, as well as where water might be available for them to use as kind of rainstorms and river flooding kind of moves through. So here's an example of what the data will look like throughout the year in tabular form for each species. This is from 2019. And what I do is I color code it for ease of interpretation. So there's this orange color where there's no migration. And this comes from points in our models prior to when biologists were collecting data in the year. So we expect the biologists are smart enough to not be trying to count ducks when there aren't ducks. So these are temperatures that are really warm and in the very negative weather severity index range. So once we get below freezing, that's where we get positive values. I know that's a little confusing, but to make sure that the weather severity index is additive, a temperature above freezing has to be given a negative symbol. A temperature below freezing is given a positive sign. The areas in red on the table are where there's increasing abundance. Between 2 times someone would go out, we'd expect to see more birds. It doesn't tell you how many more birds, but just that some birds should potentially be moving into your area at that time. What you really need to look for, though, is areas to the north of you that turn this blue color where there's decreasing abundance or a decreasing number of birds between one day and the next day that you would go out based on weather. Now, the weather severity index threshold for mallards is 5. So, if the number is 6, that doesn't mean there's going to be a large decrease in abundance. at that latitude. But once you get out, further in the 2030 weather severity index, then you see these relatively large, potentially large decreases in numbers. And so what you're really looking for is when these tables kind of light up blue, and you look at what locations may be south of those areas, and those folks should be then getting a good number of birds coming in. So what do these models look like? Here's the model for mallard and black duck with a similar threshold of 5. This basically means it has to be below freezing and possibly with some snow for some extended period of time. This contrasts with the model for Wigeon and Green-winged teal, which start leaving at a weather severity index of -10. That's actually a mean temperature of 10 degrees Celsius for a period of time. And that means that these birds are leaving well before there's a freezing event or a mean temperature of 0 degrees. So as we go through this for shovelers, we see a threshold of -9, gadwall -7, pintail -4, and for mallards and black ducks, it's 5. And this is what we would expect with changing tolerance to cold temperatures. So what's my summary for this week? Initial movements of ducks south from breeding grounds has been occurring really since mid-August at varying levels. If you think about areas across the breeding grounds of Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, those areas aren't going to be places that birds are going to be able to stay. Even with a warming planet, it's very unlikely that they're going to be able to stay. So once those hatch year birds, the birds that hatch that year can fly, they start moving south to their first staging areas, and then adults come very often slightly later. But for our part of the world, birds move out of Ontario and Quebec into the Great Lakes region, and even into September in New York, we see birds starting to show up. I mean, we get widgeon and we get pintail in central New York in September, well before season. So these initial movements of ducks have been occurring, and they're not really attributable to weather specifically. Generally, there'll be mild conditions in the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways for the coming week, and no substantial migration is expected really this week. Small movements of early migrating dabbling ducks may occur in the Mississippi flyway at extreme northern latitudes, and that's movements out of those areas and maybe slightly further south. And by early migrating dabbling ducks, we mean everything other than those hardy mallards and black ducks, which tend to stay later. And then even more limited movements of these ducks in the Atlantic flyway in the coming week, where it'll be even slightly warmer. So for mallards and black ducks, this is what the table looks like right now. No blue even showing up in extreme northern Ontario. So again, some early, post-breeding season movements of the birds, but no noticeable migration because of weather is planned for the coming week, or forecast for the coming week. So if we look at this for Syracuse, New York, and I'll create these for different spots for different species throughout the year and compare them to last year. Well below the threshold weather that makes these birds move. And you can see 2020 is pretty flat right now. That's the dotted line with the open circles. And then the closed circles with the thick line. There was some increase in weather severity last year to this time, but well below the threshold. For pintail, we start seeing some blue creep in, and that basically means there's opportunity for some small movements of these birds late in the week out of the latitude of North Dakota, but they're just barely below that threshold. So this isn't a major movement of pintail yet. And in the east, we don't really see much. Whatever showed up in that, that early staging movement into the east is probably what we should expect for the coming week. Gadwall shows us pretty much the same thing for the most part, with very little movement in the east. And shovelers as well, not much different from gadwall. Some movement out of the most northern locations, especially late this week. Not substantial movement, and not much when we get to the Atlantic flyway. Not anything really when we get to the Atlantic flyway. When we look at Wigeon and Green-winged teal, we have the opportunity for a little bit more movement, maybe some movement of these birds into the latitude of Iowa during the coming week. But again, in the Atlantic flyway, we don't expect to see much movement at all. In the future, when this lights up blue, that's when we can really look forward to seeing heavy movements of birds based on weather. So what's that look like, though, when we compare the Wigeon and Green-winged teal, compare it to 2019? The 2020 is those closed circles and that dotted line, which just passed the threshold for Devils Lake, North Dakota, late in the week. It's forecast too late in the week. Whereas in 2019, there was probably a pretty good movement of these birds out of this region in mid-October. At least our model would have predicted that well beyond the threshold. So we see right now 2020 is much milder weather severity index-wise than 2019 for Wigeon and Green-winged teal. Arctic sea ice did something funny this week. It really it didn't grow as we would expect. If you look at the blue line for 2020, we would expect that to make a pretty strong uptick. It looks like a lot like that flattening that happened in 2016. And why is this Arctic sea ice important? Well, episode 1 of our podcast here explains the importance of Arctic sea ice, but it does have an effect on high and low pressure systems and can affect our winter weather in eastern North America. So what is this really? What's it telling us? The planet's really hot, and ice is not accumulating at the rate in the Arctic that we would expect. September was the warmest global temperature on record in 126 years and third warmest for the United States. And so this Arctic sea ice is accumulating slowly. And again, this pattern, all of these weather patterns seem to look like 2016. So if you keep records of weather and hunting from 2016, it might be good to look at because I feel like it might mimic, this year might mimic that 2016 year. So what is Siberian snow cover telling us? It's really too early to tell, but the snow extent is building relatively quickly. Why does this matter? Well, Siberian snow cover creates pressure systems which can lead to a polar vortex disruption or outbreak of cold in eastern North America or the Mississippi and Atlantic flyways in December and January. So it's good to keep an eye on this. It's been pretty good in the past 20 years at forecasting our kind of later, winter weather, December and January, that's important for southern latitudes. But this depends on a lot of factors, and it's kind of too early with any confidence to tell what's going to be going on. Our river gauges, we should also probably be keeping an eye on. I have friends down in Lake Charles, and I hope everybody's okay in that part of the world. I know they got water that they didn't need. I was kind of hoping it would come on shore as a tropical storm and then curl up over the Mississippi and hit the Northeast a little bit. It kind of went across towards Washington, D.C. and gave folks water that didn't need water. And the Northeast and portions of the upper Midwest are still in kind of a drought type condition. Why does this matter for waterfowl migration and hunting? Well, if these birds in the Northeast start getting a lot of disturbance and there's not a lot of places to go, they may move south early. Why does it matter to folks in the South? Well, if you've been leaning against the same oak tree for 20 years, you might want to be a little more mobile this year because there's a lot of water out there and the birds are probably going to be spread out, which can reduce hunting success despite a lot of ducks potentially being around. So again, email me your questions at weeklyduckmigrationforecast@gmail.com. Subscribe to this YouTube channel. Our second weekly duck migration forecast, or episode 3, will be out on Sunday, 18 October, or maybe the Monday after. And these forecasts are going to continue weekly until the end of January. So we hope that things pick up a little bit. Mild weather is forecast for October through November, so it might not really get exciting till December time. But spend some time outdoors with family, be safe, and shoot straight. See you folks next week. Thanks a bunch.